Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells. I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and I talk about games on the internet. Today, I want to talk about the Book of Uther, right here. Uh, it is a book that goes with the Pendragon role playing game, one of my favorites that I love to talk about. This is Arthurian role playing, and the Book of Uther in particular talks about Arthur's father, King Uther. This is in many ways intended as an addendum to the Great Pendragon Campaign, but it includes a lot of other information about the period. And so I'm going to talk about it in terms of the campaign, even though you might still find value in it, even if you aren't playing through the campaign. Basically, the Pendragon Campaign is the 80-year long story of Arthur's life, starting slightly before he was born and going all the way up to the fall of Camelot, 80 approximately years later. Um, that begins in the year 485, when all the players are knights of Salisbury who are working with Count Roderick, and Uther isn't really the High King yet. 485 is when a bunch of Saxons invade, and Uther decides to fight them off, and in doing so, more or less announces himself as a candidate for high kingship. It's his coming out party. It's like King Uther's quinceañera, as he's like, okay, we're going to do this for real. We've gone 5 years without a high king. It's high time you all just chose and you all followed me. And so that's a good enough place to start the campaign. But if you buy the Book of Uther, you can actually start 5 years earlier than that in the year 480. And I think that there are three main reasons why that is a really good idea. But before we get into those reasons, let me tell you what this book has. Um, the Uther period is very different from the rest of the Arthurian timeline in that it is before the age of chivalry. It is before the refinement and the romance that Arthur and his influence brought to the realm. And it is also before the heavy influence of Merlin and magic. Merlin is here, sort of, but this is long before the Forest Sauvage gets incredibly weird. It's before Excalibur shows up. There's it, and so without the magic to define it, and without the chivalry to define it, the Uther period is very kind of brutal. It is about might makes right. It is a good example of why Arthur was able to do so much good by showing up and enforcing law and order and chivalry onto this system. You get to spend a few years understanding what life used to be like before Arthur fixes everything. And that's a really great thing to have. And yes, the Great Pendragon Campaign does include several years of Uther. And yes, Excalibur and Merlin do show up as part of that. But this book doesn't. So if you want to start early on with this, what it has in the beginning is copious amounts of information of what that early, brutal, pre-chivalrous period of history was like. And my very favorite part of the book is this enormous header right here. This book is a resource for game masters who wish to further explore King Uther's court. There is more detail than we hope any game master would ever use, except to perhaps baffle and bewilder adventurous knights at court. And that is true. There is far more information in here than any reasonable game master would ever need, let alone want. But that's kind of what makes it fun. So what we have in here is a huge description of what the kingdom is like. At this point, it isn't really called Britain. It isn't really called England. It's, the region that Uther's in charge of, or wants to be in charge of, is called Logres. And so you get an early map of Britain in 480 AD, and the kingdom of Logres down here in the corner. And then it talks about everything. It talks about what the culture is like. It talks about how much stuff costs. It talks about who's in charge of what, where all the forests are, where all the castles are. One of the parts that I do think is super handy is there's a part where it talks about his court. And so, and flipping through this, you can't really see me turning pages. While, it goes into his genealogy and his heraldry and kind of how his court function, and that's all great information that may or may not ever come up in the course of your game. But then it gets into this section right here, where it starts listing titles and names and backgrounds and stats for all of these people. And this is very valuable game master information. If you are the one who's telling this story and you're running your players through it, whether they're part of the campaign or not, if they're in the Uther period, they're eventually going to need to know, like, who is his bodyguard? Well, it's Bellius. Who is, his heir? Well, it's Madoc, which is a big part of the storyline. Who is his chamberlain? Who are his champions? Who are the thugs that he hires to do stuff? And so we have all of these people. We have stats and a bio for the king's huntsman. We have, Ulfius, the Duke of Silchester, that's his main marshal. The marshal's the person who literally marshals all of the knights to war. And there's just pages and pages of all of these things. And having run people through this campaign, I can assure you this is very valuable information to have. You need an NPC at any point for any reason? Here's everyone. Statistics and background for every possible person in King Uther's court that you could run across. And it goes into that. It talks about what is the church like during this period of history. What is the legal system like during this period of history? And just keeps going and going and going. But the real meat of it, and I suspect the real reason that the average purchaser is going to purchase this, is the expansion of the Great Pendragon Campaign. So like I said, that campaign begins in 485, and if you have that big, thick book, then it starts in 485. This goes back to 480, and therefore gives you 5 extra years to play. And I said that there were 3 main reasons why I think this book is valuable, and why starting 5 years earlier actually can improve the story quite a bit. Number 1 is Prince Madoc. Madoc, in the typical campaign, when you start in 485, he is already the prince, he is already the heir, and he's just one more person. When you start here in 480, it begins with Madoc is an illegitimate, unrecognized son of Uther. And what we did in our group, and what worked very well, was for him to spend the first part of that first adventure as a friend of the knights. The recommended way to start a Pendragon campaign is the ceremony of knighthood. You have to go through a few trials, and then you do a vigil in the church, and then you do the vows, and you actually, give your players you ask them to repeat the little vow where they promise that they will uphold, their values and be virtuous and good and wonderful. And it's a really fun way to start a campaign. You can have Madoc start with them, because he's just another run-of-the-mill knight at this point. And then, in that first adventure, Uther recognizes him, and he becomes the prince. And the way this changes the story is if you start Madoc off as equal to the players, they become very good friends. And so, over the course of the rest of, Madoc's life, the player characters are a lot closer, more emotionally invested in his storyline and in all the things that happen to him. And it adds a lot, I think, to the storytelling. The second reason that it's a good idea to start in 480 is because that is Uther's coronation. And so whereas 485 does have a great big battle, the Battle of Mercred Creek, which is a Saxon invasion, what you have in 480 is the huge battle that results in the death, spoiler warning, of King Ambrosius, who is Uther's brother. He is the High King, and he is recognized by everyone as the High King, but he falls in battle in 480. The first battle that the characters participate in, the High King dies. And so you kick this off not only with, you're friends with the prince, but then you get to start by, in this enormous battle, fighting alongside the High King, and then he dies, and so you get this revenge story, and then you have the funeral of the High King, you have the coronation of Uther, and you get this just really fantastic hook to kick the whole thing off. And I really love what they have done with that. The third reason that I think it's a good idea to start here is that in 484, which is the very last thing in the Uther book and before the Great Pendragon Campaign starts, you go up north, and there's a battle there with the king of Malahout, who is fighting against two Saxon warlords, Octa and Eosa. And they are big deal. They are a major antagonist in the early stages of the Pendragon Campaign. But the introduction that they get in the Book of Uther is much better, in my opinion, than the introduction that they get in the Great Pendragon Campaign. You have a chance to actually see them in battle, you fight against them, and it's really great. And that happens in 484. In the Great Pendragon Campaign, you won't see them again until 490. And you've heard about them. They're definitely present in the story as we're going to have to take care of these guys at some point. But when you finally fight them in 490 at the Battle of Lindsey, it doesn't quite have as much emotional impact if it's the first time you've ever met any of them. And so starting with the Book of Uther and these 5 extra years gives you a chance to introduce them as villains and, get them on screen, let the characters know their names and their faces a little better. So anyway, I really love what the Book of Uther adds to the Great Pendragon Campaign. It does take a little longer for the main story to get started. You have those 5 early years in which you're more or less just kind of thugs to this unchivalrous king who's going around and trying to do some stuff. You don't have as much Merlin. You don't have as much of the kind of core Arthur story, which begins very quickly after this ends. You get into 485, and Uther decides he wants to be High King. 486, 487, you start doing jobs for Merlin, and you get Excalibur pretty soon. And so, if you are willing to take the time, basically 5 extra game sessions, each year being 1 session, take that extra time to start earlier and delay the actual kind of magical Arthurian elements of the story for a little bit, I do think that it can result in a much richer story overall that has a lot of cool stuff going for it. So anyway, it's up to you to choose which one you like. I think both ways of doing the campaign are good. For me, I will always run it with the Book of Uther because I love what it adds to it. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this review. I hope that it's given you a good sense of what that book is like. And Pendragon's a wonderful game. Give it a try. You'll love it. And definitely check out the Book of Uther as well. Thank you very much. I will see you on my next review.